Hi, I'm Lou Prestia from EFI. I'm here today to talk about the new color settings on the Fiery for Fiery System FS300 and FS300 Pro and newer systems. You'll find linked to this video a PDF document that describes how you can get to the color settings from within the Command Workstation client for the Fiery server. This first page also gives some background information about the settings we'll be configuring in case some of this is new to you. The format that I'll use for today's presentation is this. On the left, I'm showing you the color settings, and again, you can see from the first page we get to the job properties for the color settings of a job on the Fiery by bringing the job into Command Workstation, double-clicking on it, going to the color navigation at the left side, and then you can see this user interface for the color properties for that job. Remember that the best practice is not to go to the properties for each job you ever import, but when you finish, you see up here at the upper left of this window, it says Presets. After you configure a way to print on a particular paper or for a particular customer, we recommend you save a preset that will have not only all your color settings, but your imaging settings and media settings and all the other things that you want to control about a job so you can consistently do prints on either that kind of paper or for a particular customer. So the format we're going to use today is we're going to map what you can see in the user interface for the color controls at the left to this diagram that we've created at the right. We're going to study 4 kinds of source colors. So imagine if I had a PDF or a PostScript file. There's really, to simplify it, there's 4 kinds of colors that can be in that file. RGB color spaces, CMYK color spaces, grayscale color spaces, and separation, or what we call spot color spaces. As we go through the settings, I'll show you what they do for all these color controls in the middle column, such as the first one that says color space and shows you these 4 color spaces. If you've seen the previous video like this one, for Fiery System FS200, you'll notice some new things today. In FS300, we've added a control for CMYK rendering intent. We have added a set of controls for grayscale source objects, which used to be color managed the same as CMYK. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. The first thing I configure in my color settings is I configure the color mode that I want to print in, which is just to say, do I want to print in CMYK or grayscale mode? Do I want a color print or a black and white print? The next thing I choose is my output profile. I can either choose the output profile specific, such as this one for the plain paper Fiery Demo plain US text, or I can use the hierarchy that the Fiery uses to pick color spaces. So I can pick the output profile specifically, like you see here, Fiery Demo plain US test, but a better way to do this is to let the Fiery automatically select the output profile for the type of paper I'm printing on. So the way we get that to work is this. This flowchart shows me that when I come into looking for a output profile, the first thing we look at is that control I was just showing you. If the job properties say Use Media Define Profile, then we'll automatically search for the right profile for your paper. So if that's yes, the next question is, are you using the paper catalog for this job? Paper catalog is the best way to set the output profile selection on the Fiery if your Fiery offers paper catalog. If the paper catalog is in use, then I will go and use the profile assigned in the paper catalog, and that's the perfect way to get the right profile assigned to my paper. Let's look at these other possibilities. If I get all the way down to the paper catalog and you haven't assigned a profile in the paper catalog entry, then we'll look for a profile assigned to the paper type. And that's also true if the paper catalog's not used and you set Use Media Define Profile, the Fiery says, where's the paper catalog entry? Give me the profile in that paper catalog entry. But if it looks and the paper catalog isn't used, maybe you've picked all the details for the paper yourself, so the finish and the weight and the size and all these different things that the paper catalog automates for you. If you've picked all these different things, then the paper type you've selected, which is usually like coated or uncoated or plain or heavy white, can be used to select the profile if we've assigned that on the Fiery in Command Workstation. So that's the second of the best way, where we automatically pick the output profile based on the media type. If we find there's no profile in the paper catalog and there's no profile assigned to the media type in the device center of Command Workstation, then we're going to use the default color profile for the server. And finally, if all the way back up here at the start, if I don't set Use Media Defined Profiles, then I'll see, or I'll get, the exact profile I picked. So again, the recommended setting is to use job-defined settings, use the paper catalog to match all the profiles to the paper that you want to print on. Remember that if you create your output profiles using Fiery Color Profiler Suite, in the course of making a profile in the Printer Profiler or the Express Profiler, we automatically assign the profile to the paper catalog entry you selected when creating the calibration and profile. The next thing that we see is that the calibration set, which is used with the output profile for this particular paper, is linked to that output profile. So when I pick the output profile to use job-defined settings, I immediately see the calibration for the way the job is set up, in this case for the way the paper catalog entry is assigned to this job over in the media section rather than the color section. When I talk about input spaces, the first one I want to talk about is RGB. And there's really two ways that RGB can exist in your PDF or your PostScript file. It can be device dependent, meaning it doesn't have any color definition or ICC profile assigned to it, or it can be device independent, meaning that it does have a color space or an ICC profile associated with it. So if I have a file coming in that is RGB, and I set this first color input control here at the left to sRGB, then that sRGB profile is going to be used for every RGB objects in my job. The next thing I can set is I can set to use embedded profiles for RGB. If I set use embedded RGB profile, you see that this RGB in the file actually has an embedded profile of Adobe RGB. When I set use embedded, then that will get applied. This is the best practice for RGB files, which typically come from digital cameras and other workflows that accurately assign the source profile. So for a best practice, we recommend that you set use RGB embedded profiles. The RGB source, generally we recommend you set to sRGB, which will configure your Fiery to do the best job with best printing with office jobs. You might choose to set this to something like Adobe RGB if you're in a closed workflow and you know that all the designers are using that color space. But in any event, Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign and these other applications, Acrobat, will typically today automatically embed the profiles in RGB. So if you just set this use embedded, then that RGB source is really only used by Office documents which don't have embedded profiles, and those are ubiquitously sRGB. For CMYK, this works the same way. I pick a specific default profile here, like PSO coded, and that will be assigned to all my CMYK data. So the next thing we can set is use CMYK embedded profiles. This will cause the embedded profile, such as the grayscale profile that you see embedded in this CMYK, to be used. In general, we recommend that the use embedded CMYK profiles be left off for best practices. The reason is CMYK in a shop is typically all from the same source. It's typically all from the same country or the same set of customers. Some shops, traditional shops, do special things with CMYK, such as stripping out the profiles. So we've seen cases of CMYK with mismatched profiles assigned, and we think you get the most consistent results if you pick the profile for your geographic region, which is probably PSO coded if you're in Europe, or something like grayscale if you're in the United States, and just leave that set and not honor the CMYK embedded profiles. The next thing I can set is the source profile for my gray. And again, this is new in FS300. Historically, we processed the grayscale using kind of a fixed transformation to get from the grayscale information in the page description file, the PDF or PostScript, into the color management workflow. With FS300, you can now use a specific grayscale profile, such as dot gain 10%, and this is the one that will get used with all my files. Typically, dot gain 20% is the default in Photoshop. I think you might want to check. It's always safe to use the embedded profiles with grayscale sources, which again, if they're created in Photoshop, will have the right profile embedded. Since this is a new feature, I want to spend a little more time on it. All the grayscale source profile really affects is the gamma, or the contrast. So if you find that your prints are looking too washed out, you might want to try a lower dot gain. And if the black and white print, or the images that you know are coming in as grayscale, not CMYK or RGB, are printing too dark, then you might want to go to a little bit lighter dot gain setting. The next thing I said is the rendering intents. The rendering intent is my preference for gamut compression on the Fiery. That means that when I take this Adobe RGB image that I'm showing in this column and I convert it into the output profile, I'm going to get gamut compression. The Adobe RGB gamut is much bigger than any printer gamut that we have today. So whenever we have gamut compression, we need to tell the color management system on the Fiery how we want the gamut compression done. Photographic is the best choice for photographs and for converting very large gamuts to much smaller gamuts to keep all the colors looking natural. They're not necessarily as accurate, since we have to compress the very bright and saturated colors at some edges of the gamut to fit into the printer profile, but photographic moves all the colors in the source gamut to fit the destination, so we still have a natural appearance if we have a photograph. You'll see there's other choices here. Presentation is what I would choose if I was printing RGB business graphics. Relative colorimetric is the most precise one, but isn't very good if I'm going from a very big to a very small gamut. This might work if I was printing on a very large gamut paper, like a heavyweight coated paper. I might choose to use relative colorimetric with my RGB, but as soon as we see something like shadows starting to plug up in the reproductions, that's a sign that we should probably be using photographic. And again, that is our recommended best practice. New in FS300 is we also set the rendering intent for CMYK. So remember, historically the Fiery had three choices for the CMYK processing method. It had GCR source, it had output GCR, and it had pure primaries. Both the source and the output GCR used the relative colorimetric intent, but the source GCR tried to use the black generation from the input profile. This would not work very well in this example I'm showing you here. The gray channel, or the black channel that we've built into the Grackle profile, has nothing to do with your digital press. So that's why output was always recommended. That uses the black channel that we built in the output profile for that printer, for that paper. Going forward with FS300 and newer, we don't have to worry about this. We can choose all the same rendering intents that I described a minute ago. There's two more choices here. One I didn't talk about, which is called absolute colorimetric. This is the same as colorimetric. It's very precise. It doesn't compress the source gamut to the destination gamut. It just clips any colors that are outside the edge of the gamut. And when I'm going from a CMYK source to a CMYK output, unless I'm printing on some very low quality paper, I have very similar size gamuts. So relative colorimetric is always the right choice. Absolute colorimetric is the same as colorimetric, but it simulates paper white. So if you're a longtime Fiery user, you remember that up until FS200, there was a control in this panel that said simulate paper white. If we wanted to do proofing and print on the output the paper color of the source profile, like this Grackle profile. It's pretty much only useful for proofing. If you make a production print where you print dots in the non-image area to simulate the paper color, you're going to have a very hard time selling that print. So the control is still here. If you're doing proofing, then you use absolute colorimetric. You don't have to configure that setting for simulate paper white. This does the same thing. Finally, for CMYK, we have the choice called pure primaries. This is not the same as the presentation, or what is sometimes called the saturation rendering intent. This is more about keeping the colors very pure. So if I have a yellow and I don't want 3 or 5% magenta dots in my pure yellow because maybe I'm printing some big piece and it doesn't look right with those little magenta dots in there, pure primaries will try to keep the CMYK primaries clear and pure all the way out to their most saturated points. Again, recommended setting is relative colorimetric. For grayscale, we also recommend relative colorimetric. Again, grayscale images are not created in a big Adobe RGB space. They're usually more or less like the CMYK space, so relative colorimetric is the best choice. One other control I have here just for my CMYK is called black point compensation. Black point compensation, when I use the relative colorimetric rendering intent, maps the black point of the source to the black point of the destination, which always makes sense. We want to get the full dynamic range of the output, even if the dynamic range of the input was less. So we want to map that darkest point in the input to the darkest point in the output. The only time I wouldn't use black point compensation is again if I was doing a proofing workflow, because when I'm proofing, I typically want to represent the perhaps smaller dynamic range of the input file on my print. And the example you can see if you were really interested in doing this is if you were proofing newsprint and you had newsprint source images printing on your Fiery on some nice paper. If you turn black point compensation on, the prints will look much better than they would on the newspaper. If you turn black point compensation off, then we won't map that relatively light black point in the newsprint source profile to your Fiery maximum black point, and you'll see that the prints look very washed out, and you're now making a proof of how they'd look on the newspaper. The next control I have here is for what we call print gray using black only. So you'll see something on the first page of the PDF that talks about this, and you'll often hear people talk about PGUBO, P-G-U-B-O, which is a short way of saying print gray using black only. The reason this control is important is because this control is used when I have what looks like a black and white page and I don't want to get a color click charge for it. So if you're getting pages that you're charging your customers black and white and they have RGB in them, maybe RGB that's created from various applications but could include Microsoft Word or any of the Office applications are great examples. Because they're RGB colors, the Fiery naturally wants to print them in color. So what looks like a black and white page and what you probably estimate and bill your customer for as a black and white page can print as a color click charge. Print gray using black only looks for objects that are only gray. So this is defined as red equals green equals blue, and again a solid black pixel, what might look like black text, is probably going to be red and green and blue all equal. The print gray using black only control on the Fiery lets me choose three modes. If I turn it off, then we'll print those colors as color. You'll get a color click charge. If I set it to text graphics, then we'll look at all the objects on the page that are either fonts, text, or vector graphics, and for those objects, if red equals green equals blue, we'll print them using black only to save the color click charge. The third choice is I could enable this for text graphics and images. The risk here is that you probably have photographs that have gray pixels in them with red equals green equals blue. If you're printing a color photo, I don't want those pixels to drop out and print black only. So the recommended setting for print RGB gray using black only is to set this to text and graphics so we don't affect those images. When it comes to CMYK, we have a different definition for finding a gray. We look for pixels that have no cyan, magenta, or yellow, so they all equal 0%, and something in the black channel, which could be any percent. We have the same choices to ignore this and make a color click, to do this for text and graphics objects only, or to do this for all the objects on the page, including the text and the vector graphics and the images. In the CMYK world, it's very uncommon to have a CMYK separation, a color picture, that has only the black channel. So it's relatively safe in the recommended setting to set this to text graphics images for the print gray using black only for CMYK. When we go to the grayscale sources, that's the same discussion. In this case, we only have one channel. You certainly don't want to have that converted and printed as color if you think it's a grayscale page, so we'll typically set this to text graphics images. The next control we have deals with the last column on the right here, which is spot colors. So spot colors are named colors, such as Pantone colors, for example, want to be looked up through a special table on the Fiery, which is the licensed libraries we have from companies like HKS and Pantone and many others. If you want to use those named color libraries, which is the best practice, you need to turn on spot color matching. That means that any edits you may make to those colors, such as in Fiery Spot On, or any optimizations you may make to those spot colors, such as you can with Fiery Color Profiler Suite using a spectrophotometer, will be honored. If spot color matching is turned off, then we will print the colors of that named color object, that, let's say, brand object, using the alternate definition in the PostScript or PDF file. Sometimes this will be close, sometimes this is not nearly the right definition, and regardless, you have no control to edit it unless you turn on spot color matching so that you can edit that color in the spot color table using Fiery Spot On. New feature in FS300 is that I can pick the spot group. So historically, some of you may know that when I'm in Spot On, if I'm printing a job with Pantone colors, and let's say it's a legacy job, and I want to use the old Pantone version 2 before the Pantone Plus series definitions, which were different, then I can put that library on top in Spot On, run the job, and I'll get the old Pantone definitions. If I'm running a new job and I want to use Pantone Plus version 3, the latest Pantone coded library, even though the color has the same name in that job like Pantone 386C, if I want the new definitions, I've got to drag that other library on top. And because those colors were changed or remeasured by Pantone in some cases between the legacy and the Pantone Plus libraries, you won't get the same color both ways. So this has made it very frustrating for users who for one job have to put one file on top, another the other on top. Even if you're not in that situation and you're always using Pantone Plus version 3, still there are cases where we make custom edits for one customer. We don't want their spot color edit to affect all the other jobs we run. So this use spot group control lets me pick a spot color library from Spot On, and it essentially puts it on top. It forces it on top of the list, so we get the color definitions in that spot library before any others. Now if it's not found, we still search down through the list in Spot On trying to find that color, but this is a way you can set the priority for the spot color library you want to run. So that is more or less all of the color input section that we have in the new command workstation for FS300. I'll talk a little bit now about these color settings at the end. The first one is the PDFX output intent. The PDFX output intent is actually an ICC profile that can be embedded in a PDFX4 file. This profile is embedded to say how I want the job to look no matter how I print it. So if I embed this new Grackle CRPC6 profile in a PDFX4 file, I want the job to look that way whether I have RGB inputs, CMYK inputs, whether I look at it on screen, whether I print it on a high quality stock or a lower quality stock. The way we get the PDFX4 compliance with the output intent is to check this box. This box, if checked, will look into the PDFX4 output intent tag, which you see at the right here. Just for an example, we embedded this CRPC6 profile, and it will use that for all these transformations. So it will convert from the source space through the output intent from the PDFX so that you get consistent output and you're compliant with the PDFX4 specification. The next control, separate RGB Lab to source, is mainly for proofing. Converts the RGB not directly to the output profile through its source profile like Adobe RGB, but instead converts the source RGB to the source CMYK that we've set up, such as Grackle. And then we go to the output. Okay? This control is also required for PDFX4 compliance, since we want, as I showed you on the last slide, the RGB to also flow through that profile from the PDFX4 output intent. Generally, best practice is we leave this off along with PDFX output intent unless you know you're getting PDFX4 files that are truly compliant with the specification. Leaving either of these on could compromise your workflow. PDFX output intent because there might be something embedded the customer didn't know about, and separate RGB Lab to CMYK because that will naturally clip the gamut of your RGB to your source CMYK. You might have a bigger output gamut on a nice coated stock on your fiery driven press that you want to get the maximum out of for your RGB. So we would never recommend, again, unless you're proofing or doing a PDFX4 workflow, that you convert all that data through the CMYK source profile. The next setting is for black processing. Black processing is for solid black, which is defined as RGB equals 0, or CMYK at 100%, or grayscale at 100%. And in all these cases, we have three choices. If we turn pure black on, then the solid black will print with, that is the 000 RGB or the 100% K, will print with 100% black colorant only on the fiery. This is the best practice. If we print solid black text and graphics with 4 colors, we can often see haloing around the small fonts and fine lines. So pure black, which keeps it black only, is recommended. There's 2 more choices here. Rich black would print black with a support screen of 40% cyan behind it. This is a good trick if you have a big black fill that isn't looking right and the designer built it as black only, but we'd use that only for a special case. And if I set it for normal, then again I'm going to get quad tone 4-color output of my solid black, and if I have fine lines or graphics, and remember this doesn't apply to images, only to text and graphics, then I can see some haloing. So we recommend pure black on. The next control we have is whether we want to overprint the pure black. So if I have a solid piece of type that's black only, it's RGB of 0 or it's CMYK of 0% in all the channels, but black is at 100%, do I want to overprint this? We can say to overprint just text, or to overprint text and graphics, or not to overprint anything. The best practice is to just overprint text. The reason we recommend you do not overprint graphics is that if you have a large black-only graphic sitting atop a color background, which might be a colored vignette, if you overprint that at a large font size, which is usually a graphic, then the black will appear to change weight over the vignette as the vignette goes from light to dark. If we set this to text, almost always our fonts and things that are defined in the page description language as a font or as text are at a small size, and we can very safely overprint them. So our recommendation there is to set that to text. A few final settings here. Composite Overprint takes objects that were intended to overprint in a PostScript file and causes them to overprint so that we can see through them. As you see in the example at the left, this is with overprint on, which is what the designer intended. This is how it looked in Illustrator when they created this graphic. If we have overprint off, then these objects will knock each other out. We will almost always fail to get the appearance that the designer or the art director expected. So we should always leave Composite Overprint enabled. The next one is 2-color print mapping. This lets me map a job from black and one particular color, either cyan, magenta, or yellow, to another combination, which is black and a specific Pantone color. Okay? It's not a particularly useful feature. Some people use it for plate making in some markets, but there probably isn't any application in the workflows you're doing with most of your modern fireys. Substitute colors lets me specify substitute colors as part of Fiery Spot On. So in the same way that I can go to Spot On and I can edit an existing spot color, or I can add my own spot color, and I can even measure it with a spectrophotometer to create a new spot color if I need to, I can also within Spot On add a group of substitute colors. With a substitute color, I can specify a specific tint of RGB or CMYK that I want to look for in the incoming job and convert it to a different color. So the way we typically use this is to map a logo color, such as the Fiery logo I'm showing here. If that Fiery logo is in an Office document, it's not going to be a spot color. It's not going to come in with a spot color definition. It's going to come in as RGB. But if I look at the graphic that I'm placing into my Office document, I can see that this has the values you see at the top here of red 119, green 147, and blue of 60. If I go and create a substitute color on the Spot On the Fiery, and I put in those input values 119, 147, 60, then I can map that to the right CMYK values that I need to match that logo color. We can also do this for CMYK. I need to turn on substitute colors here in the color settings for these substitute values to be used. And since many people use this to get especially Office documents printing correctly, you should always leave that enabled. Combined separations is used for legacy PostScript files that had pre-separated data. These are very uncommon today. If you have them in your workflow, you probably know, and you should leave this on. But if you don't, you probably want to leave this disabled. AutoTrapping causes the Fiery to trap adjacent colors that are not similar, such as this red next to this black. If we have a registration problem or a fit problem on the digital press, and the colors tend to come apart, as you see on the left here, trapping overlaps the colors. It spreads the lighter of the colors into the darker of the colors by just 1 or 2 pixels to hide that gap. Generally, we leave this off unless you're printing on a press, or usually it's a specific media, sometimes like a film or a thin media, that has this alignment problem, so then I'd enable auto-trapping just for those specific jobs. We also have a control here for optimize RGB transparency, much like the overprint problem that I talked to you about, which is historically a PostScript problem. In PDF files created with the modern Adobe applications, we get all kinds of transparency blending operations, such as when the designer creates a drop shadow or does other special effects. The only way to ensure that our transparency objects, or our transparent objects in the page with these different blending styles, appear correctly on the print, which is to say the way they appear in Adobe Acrobat on the screen, is to enable this control called Optimize RGB Transparency. And again, we recommend that you leave that on as a best practice. The last thing to talk about is the Image Viewer Curves. Image Viewer Curves lets me pick a specific tone correction for this job. So there's some from the factory, including a couple of tonal corrections to open up the quarter tones or boost the mid-tones or open up the three-quarter tones. There's also 3 factory cast corrections which pull cyan or magenta or yellow out of the quarter tone if you're seeing a cast on the print. These image viewer curves can be customized in Fiery Image Viewer. So if you have a Fiery that has the Fiery Graphic Arts Package Premium Edition for an external server, or a Fiery with the Productivity Package for embedded bustled Fiery server, then you have Image Viewer. With this, you can actually open up a job, the raster of a job after it's been ripped, make your own custom curve corrections, and they'll show up in this section here. Okay? Again, we wouldn't recommend you pick one of these and always run with it, but this is a very good way to do a last-minute fix, either if you don't have Image Viewer and things are looking too red on a particular job and you don't have time to recalibrate, or if you do have Image Viewer, then of course you can do all kinds of sophisticated things with bringing in curves here, including importing G7 curves from the G7 software to Image Viewer to create a G7 NPDC curve that you could choose to load here if you're not using Fiery Color Profiler Suite to do G7 calibration of Fieries in the United States. So this is our full set of recommended settings, what we call the best practice settings for configuring color on the Fiery. We encourage any questions or comments you have on the Fiery forums in the color section. I and other people will be happy to look at them there and answer any questions you may have. And we thank you very much for your time in watching the presentation.